Tim is the Deputy General Secretary with the International Federation of Journalists. Does Gaza, for you, Tim, stand out in terms of how journalists have been covering the conflict?
It absolutely does. I don't think there's any real comparisons around the world. International correspondents were locked out at the very beginning of this conflict, and since then, a very brave and determined group of Gazan journalists have brought all of the pictures, the sounds, and the words that we've had from the Gaza Strip against the most extraordinary onslaught that has really ever been visited upon journalists. We know over 100 now have lost their lives. Many appear to be in highly targeted attacks guided by artificial intelligence, sort of targeted bombs. But they have continued to do their work, which is extraordinary and is a testament to their commitment to get the stories about Gaza out and to tell the world about what's happening to them.
Tim, do you get the impression that it's actually these local Palestinian journalists who are doing most of the, let's call it, heavy lifting in terms of showing and telling the world what's been happening? I've seen journalists who work for some of the biggest Western broadcasters in Gaza, and quite often I see them with the Israeli military because obviously they need protection and they're getting that protection from Israeli soldiers. But maybe Palestinian journalists aren't, of course.
Well, so far as I'm aware, the relatively few Western journalists who've been into Gaza have been in, accompanied by the Israeli military, and with the Israeli military taking, some element of editorial control of their output. Everything that comes from Gaza, so far as I'm aware, has come from Gazan journalists. And actually, your term heavy lifting is a prescient one, because everybody in Gaza has very little food, very little water, and very little fuel. The journalists are mostly walking to their assignments, carrying their broadcast equipment on their shoulders. So they are quite literally doing the heavy lifting to try and get about the enclave and to gather as much pictures as they can. And actually, watching your colleague talking about the blast vests reminded me of an interesting thing a Gazan journalist told me the other day. There are very few of those blast vests available. They're very difficult to come by. So some journalists are having them made up by tailors. They don't have the armor plating, so they just have foam rubber inside them. They look the part, and they obviously inform the rest of the world that they're journalists. But in terms of protection, they provide none whatsoever.
I believe we've got some exclusive footage of the moment those tank shells fell in the Nuseirat refugee camp, and that's obviously resulted in these 3 Palestinian journalists being injured and our colleague from TRT Arabi having to have one of his legs amputated. In terms of how journalists move around Gaza, in terms of where they can go, how they can be in any one place at a certain time, is there any sort of coordination with either of the opposing forces as far as you know over the past 6 months of how journalists have been moving around the enclave, Tim?
I'm not really aware of any, no, which isn't to say it doesn't exist. I mean, almost all of the journalists have lost their homes, so they are living in tented accommodation. In most cases, they have moved already 2 or 3 times. So, they're working in very, very challenging circumstances, and almost all of them have suffered bereavements. I would be very surprised if Hamas isn't applying some elements of coordination within the areas that they continue to have influence in. But about the specifics of that, I'm afraid I don't have any information.
Does your federation point the finger at Israeli soldiers in terms of journalists being deliberately targeted by their fire?
Well, I think there's undoubtedly a case to answer. If you look at the mortality rate, there were about 1,000 journalists at the beginning of this conflict working in Gaza. Something over 100 of them have lost their lives. That's a mortality rate of 10%. Combat soldiers don't suffer a mortality rate like that. In the 20 years of the Vietnam War, 63 journalists lost their lives. So we're talking here about a mortality rate that defies real comparison. We also know that the Israeli Defense Force has access to extraordinary technology, which allows them to surveil journalists using their mobile phones. It allows them to target either their homes or their persons using AI. And according to reports that I've read have a very casual attitude to collateral damage, accepting that entire families, entire residential blocks will be killed in pursuit of single people. I think what we need is all of this information to be considered in a court of law. The International Criminal Court would be the place to do that. The International Federation of Journalists already has complaints to the ICC in respect of Shireen Abu Akleh and several other journalists who lost their lives before this conflict. But I think we need more evidence, we need more cases, because, to be honest, there's a lot of conjecture and a lot of accusations and a lot of finger pointing. I think we need a proper judicial process when the evidence is examined and the case is properly answered about what has happened here and why so many journalists have lost their lives.
Yeah, of course, I can completely appreciate that it's very difficult possibly to directly accuse Israel of deliberately targeting journalists. So why don't we put the question another way? Are you convinced that Israel is trying to suppress reporting in Gaza?
There's no question of that. Yes, they very obviously are. The restriction of movement of international press, I think, was a very deliberate attempt to ensure that far less footage got out and to degrade the kudos that footage would have with international news platforms. I think, for all the outstanding work done by Gazan journalists, viewers in the West would expect to see familiar international reporters giving their take on what's happening, and that's not been possible. We know that within Israel, restrictions have been put on the press, and the most bizarre accusations made against any journalists who have been critical of Israel's war effort. So, yes, I think there has been an absolutely deliberate attempt to restrict and downgrade the information that the world has to try and prevent people learning what's really happened in Gaza.
Tim Dawson from the International Federation of Journalists, thank you so much indeed, Tim.
A pleasure.